I never thought visiting my best friend's house would turn into something I couldn't escape. Every weekend was the same. I'd grab my bike, throw on my backpack, and head over to Tom's house. It was like my second home. His family always welcomed me. His dad was easygoing, and his mom, well, Mrs. Mitchell, was different. She wasn't like other moms. She had this energy about her, this way of talking that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The way her eyes would linger just a second too long. The way she'd brush her hand against mine when handing me a glass of water. I told myself it was nothing, just my overactive imagination playing tricks on me. But then there were the compliments. "You're looking stronger these days," she'd say with a small smile, her eyes flicking to my arms. "Have you been working out? Or, you're going to break some hearts when you're older." Tom would laugh it off, oblivious to the way her gaze stayed fixed on me. But I felt it, an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name. It was wrong, and I knew it, but there was a part of me that couldn't ignore the thrill it gave me. One Saturday, I arrived at Tom's house to find him still asleep. His mom answered the door, her usual warm smile in place. "Tom's upstairs," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "But you're welcome to wait. I just made some coffee." I followed her into the kitchen, the air between us charged in a way I couldn't explain. She poured me a cup, her movements smooth and deliberate, as if every step were part of a dance only she knew the steps to. "You know," she said, leaning against the counter, "it's nice having you around. Tom talks about you all the time." I smiled, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, he's a great friend." She tilted her head, her gaze steady. "He's lucky to have someone like you. Not everyone's so loyal these days." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning I didn't understand. I took a sip of coffee, trying to focus on anything but the way her presence seemed to fill the room. The way she leaned closer when she spoke, her voice soft and inviting. Tom eventually stumbled down the stairs, yawning and complaining about how early it was. The spell was broken, and the day went on as usual. But that moment in the kitchen stayed with me, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. A few weeks later, Tom and I were working on a school project in his room when his mom knocked on the door. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, her eyes flicking to mine, "but I need a favor." Tom groaned. "What now?" "The garage door won't open," she said. "It's stuck again. Can you come take a look?" Tom rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath. But I stood up before he could protest. "I'll help," I offered, more eagerly than I intended. She smiled, her gaze meeting mine for a moment too long. "Thank you, darling. It'll only take a second." I followed her downstairs, the sound of Tom's music fading as we reached the garage. The door was indeed stuck, and I knelt to inspect the mechanism while she stood nearby, watching. "Thanks for helping," she said, her voice low. "Tom doesn't always appreciate how much I do around here." I glanced up, meeting her eyes. "I'm happy to help." Her smile softened, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of us. The garage door, the project, even Tom, they all faded into the background. It was just her and me, standing too close, sharing a silence that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. "Got it," I said finally, breaking the moment as I managed to fix the latch. The door groaned open, and she clapped her hands in mock applause. "You're a lifesaver," she said, her tone light, but her eyes saying something else entirely. After that, things shifted. She started finding excuses to ask for my help, carrying groceries, moving furniture, fixing little things around the house. Each time, it felt like we were playing a game, one where the rules were unclear but the stakes were high. Tom didn't seem to notice. He was too busy with his music, his games, his endless plans for the future. But I noticed. I noticed the way her hand would linger on my arm when she thanked me, the way her gaze would drift to mine during dinner, the way she'd smile when no one else was looking. It was subtle at first, harmless, but with every passing day, it felt less like a coincidence and more like an invitation. And the worst part? I didn't want to say no. The weeks that followed felt like a strange balancing act. I tried to focus on my friendship with Tom, on the things we'd always done together, playing video games, working on projects, talking about school. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the growing connection with his mother. It was in the way she smiled at me, The way her hand brushed mine when she passed me a plate at dinner. The way her voice softened when we were alone. Each moment felt small, insignificant on its own. But together, they created a picture I couldn't ignore. One evening, I found myself alone with her again. Tom had gone out with friends, leaving me behind to finish an assignment we'd been working on. I was packing up my things in the living room when she came in, her movements slow and deliberate. "You're not going out with them?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. I shook my head. "Had to finish the project?" She nodded, her gaze steady. "You're a good influence on him, you know. He needs someone like you in his life." The way she said it made my chest tighten, her words filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name. I tried to focus on my bag, on the papers scattered across the coffee table, but her presence was impossible to ignore. "Sometimes," she continued, her voice softer now, "I feel like he takes me for granted. Like he doesn't see everything I do for him." I looked up, meeting her eyes. "I'm sure he appreciates you," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Even if he doesn't show it." Her lips curved into a small smile, and she stepped closer, her hand brushing against my shoulder. "You're sweet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tom's lucky to have you as a friend." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air between us was heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. I should have stepped back, should have said something to break the tension, but I didn't. I couldn't. It started with little things. A hand resting on my arm for a moment too long. A quiet laugh, shared over an inside joke. A glance that lingered just a second more than it should have. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew the truth. The first time it happened, it was almost accidental. Tom had gone upstairs to grab something, leaving us alone in the kitchen. We were talking, laughing about something I can't even remember now, and then she reached out, her hand brushing against mine. Neither of us moved. Her gaze met mine, her smile fading as the silence stretched between us. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I should have said something, should have stepped back, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed there, my heart pounding as the moment hung in the air, fragile and dangerous." From that point on, everything changed. Our interactions were no longer casual, no longer innocent. Every look, every touch, every conversation carried an unspoken tension that left me feeling both exhilarated and terrified. Tom didn't seem to notice. He was as oblivious as ever, too caught up in his own world to see what was happening right under his nose. But that didn't make it any less dangerous. If anything, it made it worse. There were moments when I thought about ending it, about walking away before things went too far. But every time I tried, I found myself drawn back, unable to resist the pull of her presence, the way she made me feel. One afternoon, while Tom was out, she asked me to help her with something in the garage. It was a simple task, moving some boxes, but the way she looked at me, the way her voice softened when she thanked me, made it feel like something more. As I stood there, sweating and out of breath from carrying the last box, she handed me a glass of water, her fingers brushing against mine. "You're too good to me," she said, her smile soft and genuine. "It's nothing," I replied, my voice barely steady. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on mine. "It's not nothing," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're different." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt my resolve slipping. I wanted to say something, to break the tension, but before I could, she reached out, her hand resting lightly on my chest. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world seemed to shrink to just the two of us, the silence between us filled with everything we couldn't say. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was me. All I know is that one moment we were standing there, and the next the space between us was gone. Her hand slid up to my shoulder, her touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tom doesn't have to know." Her words brought me back to reality, the weight of what we were doing crashing down on me. I stepped back, my heart pounding. "We can't," I said, my voice shaking. She looked at me, her expression a mix of regret and something else, something I couldn't quite name. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." I nodded, unable to find the words to say what I was feeling. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the garage, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a heavy stone. I couldn't stop thinking about the moment in the garage. It played on repeat in my mind, the way her hand lingered on my chest, the way her voice softened when she said it was okay. It wasn't okay. None of this was, and yet, I found myself drawn to her, unable to resist the pull of her presence. I tried to avoid her after that, keeping my visits to Tom's house as short as possible, finding excuses to leave before she had a chance to pull me aside. But it didn't matter. She had a way of finding me, of creating opportunities where there shouldn't have been any. A glance across the room, a brush of her hand against mine. Each moment felt small, insignificant, but together, they built a tension I couldn't escape. One afternoon, Tom and I were in his room, playing video games like we always did. His mom knocked on the door, her voice carrying through the wood. "Tom, can you help me with something downstairs?" He groaned, pausing the game. "What now?" "It'll only take a second," she called back. Tom rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath as he left the room. I stayed behind, grateful for the reprieve. But a few minutes later, she appeared in the doorway, her expression calm, her gaze steady. She said, stepping inside. I glanced at the door, my heart pounding. "Tom's downstairs," I said quickly. "I know," she replied, her voice quiet. "I just wanted to talk." She closed the door behind her, and I felt the air in the room shift. My hands clenched in my lap as she moved closer, her presence filling the space. "You've been avoiding me," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. I looked away, my voice barely steady. I don't think it's a good idea. Whatever this is." She stepped closer, her hand brushing against mine. "You don't have to be afraid," she whispered. "No one has to know." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, a mixture of fear and exhilaration that left me feeling unsteady. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the door swung open. Tom stood there, his expression a mix of confusion and annoyance. "What's going on?" His mom stepped back quickly, her face flushing. "I was just asking him if he wanted something to drink," she said, her voice overly casual. "I thought you'd still be downstairs." Tom raised an eyebrow, but he didn't press the issue. "Okay, well, let's get back to the game." She nodded, slipping out of the room without another word. But as she left, her gaze flicked to mine, and I saw the unspoken tension in her eyes. Tom hadn't caught on. Not yet. But the close call left me shaken, a reminder of how easily this could all fall apart. I should have ended it then, should have walked away and never looked back. But I didn't. The thrill of it all, the secrecy, the danger, the connection I felt with her, it was too strong to ignore. And as much as I hated myself for it, I couldn't stay away. One evening, I arrived at Tom's house to find it unusually quiet. His dad was out of town for work, and Tom had gone to a concert with friends. His mom answered the door, her smile warm, her eyes flicking to mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "Tom's not here," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "But you can wait if you want. He should be back in a couple of hours." I hesitated, knowing I should leave, but my feet carried me inside. She led me to the kitchen, pouring me a glass of water as we talked about nothing in particular. The conversation was light, casual, but the tension between us was anything but. "You know," she said after a while, her voice softer now, "you're always welcome here. Even when Tom's not around." Her words hung in the air, and I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, she reached out, her hand resting lightly on mine. "It's okay," she whispered, her gaze steady. "You don't have to pretend." Her words shattered the fragile wall I'd built between us, and before I knew it, the distance between us was gone. Her hand slid to my shoulder, her touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. But then the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. Tom's voice echoed through the house as he called out, his footsteps growing louder as he approached the kitchen. We stepped apart quickly, the tension between us still heavy in the air. "Hey," Tom said as he walked in, his gaze flicking between us. "What's going on?" "Nothing," his mom said quickly, her voice steady. "We were just talking." Tom raised an eyebrow, but he didn't say anything, turning his attention to the fridge instead. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, the weight of what had almost happened pressing down on me. But as I looked at her, I saw the fear in her eyes, the realization that we'd come dangerously close to being caught. And in that moment, I knew that things couldn't continue like this. Something had to give. The days that followed were filled with tension. Tom didn't say anything, but I could feel his suspicion growing. The way he looked at me, the way he questioned my every move, it was as if he knew something was off but couldn't quite put his finger on it. And his mom, she was quieter now, more cautious, but the connection between us was still there, impossible to ignore. Each glance, each fleeting touch was a reminder of the line we'd crossed, the line we could never uncross. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And as much as I wanted to hold on, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that followed me everywhere I went. Something had to change. I thought I could keep it under control. I thought the boundaries we'd crossed could be erased, or at least hidden, but I was wrong. The weight of it all, the glances, the whispers, the close calls, was too much to bear. And Tom wasn't as oblivious as I'd hoped. It started with little things. The way he'd watch me when I talked to his mom, the way he'd suddenly show up whenever we were alone, his questions that seemed innocent but were loaded with suspicion. He knew something wasn't right, and it was only a matter of time before he pieced it all together. One evening, Tom invited me over to hang out, just like we always did. His tone was casual, his smile easy, but there was something in his eyes that made my stomach churn. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was imagining things. But as the evening went on, the tension became impossible to ignore. We were sitting in his room, playing video games, when he suddenly paused the game and turned to me. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice steady but sharp. "Sure," I replied, forcing myself to sound calm. "What's going on with you and my mom?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, scrambling for an answer, but the look in his eyes told me he already knew. "Nothing," I said quickly, too quickly. "Why would you think that?" He leaned back, crossing his arms as he studied me. "You're a terrible liar," he said flatly. "I've seen the way you look at her, the way she looks at you. Do you really think I'm that blind?" I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came out. The truth was there, written across my face, and we both knew it. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded, his voice rising. "It's not what you think," I stammered, my heart pounding. "It was nothing, just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "You think I didn't see what happened in the kitchen the other night? Or the way you two act when you think I'm not around?" I felt my chest tighten, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I wanted to explain, to tell him that it hadn't gone as far as he thought, that I hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But the truth was too ugly, too unforgivable. Tom stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're supposed to be my friend," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "How could you do this? To me? To my family?" "I didn't mean to," I began, but he cut me off. "Save it," he snapped. "You think I care about your excuses? You think any of this is okay?" I felt the heat rising in my face, shame and guilt mixing with the overwhelming urge to defend myself. But there was nothing I could say that would make this right. "You need to leave," he said finally, his voice cold and final. "And don't come back." I stood there for a moment, frozen, before nodding silently and heading for the door. As I walked through the house, the weight of what I'd done settled over me like a heavy blanket. I passed by the kitchen, where his mom stood, her face pale as she watched me leave. She didn't say anything, and neither did I. There was nothing left to say. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and regret. I avoided Tom's house, his calls, his texts. I couldn't face him, couldn't face what I'd done. The friendship we'd built over the years was gone, shattered by a secret I'd never meant to keep. I heard rumors at school, whispers about a falling out, about something that had happened between me and Tom's family. No one knew the truth, but the speculation was enough to make me feel like an outcast. As for his mom, I didn't see her again. She stopped answering my messages, stopped finding excuses to call me over. It was as if she'd disappeared, leaving only the memory of what we'd shared, a memory that felt more like a scar with every passing day. Looking back, I can't say I didn't see it coming. The way things spiraled out of control, the way I let myself get swept up in something I knew was wrong, it was all my fault. I should have walked away sooner, should have put an end to it before it even began. But I didn't, and now I was paying the price. I lost my best friend. I lost the trust of someone who had been like family to me. And for what? A moment of weakness, a connection that was never meant to be. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that last look she gave me as I walked out of their house. The regret in her eyes, the guilt that mirrored my own. Maybe in another life, things could have been different. But in this one, all I could do was move on, carrying the weight of my mistakes with me. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what I deserved.